Shalom, everyone, and welcome to Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet, speaking to you from Highland Park, New Jersey. Joining me are my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanowski from Congregation Anshe Chesed in New York City, and Rabbi Barry Chesler of the Solomon Schechter of Long Island. And it's great to see you guys. Shalom.
Shalom, shalom. It's good to see you.
I did just ascertain.
Yes.
If there were no COVID, camp would have gone on through August 19th. So
two Shabbos.
Two more Shabbatot for the theoretical non-existent.
Second last Shabbat or the
second to last?
Second last Shabbat. The last Shabbat would be Re'eh, which I mean, these parshas are actually, in normal years they're a little later. At least the last few years they've been later. We haven't done these at camp. So they're new for us, although this Parsha, I think we do plenty of times. This is Parshat Ekev. Ekev is a fascinating Parsha dealing with a lot of the themes that we are coming to know from this book of Deuteronomy, and specifically focused on the land, which we'll talk about shortly. I want to just begin by thinking with you about a couple of things. You know, in the first aliyah of this parsha, we have a pasuk that is familiar to all of us, especially if we recite the Birkat HaMazon. So the Birkat HaMazon verse is Ve'achalta v'savata uve'rachta et Adonai Elohecha ala haaretz hatova. Right. This is the verse that is part of the Birkat HaMazon, and this is the verse that is the basis for the blessing, and this is, of course, familiar to many of our people. But this comes out there after a whole description of the land. So let me just take a second to read this. Ki Adonai Elohecha meviacha el eretz tova. God is bringing us to a good land. Eretz nachalei mayim, a land of brooks, streams, ayonot, utomot, fountains, yotzim babikab uvahar, gushing from the mountains and from the valleys. And now, Eretz Chita Usora, Begefen Utena Verimon, a land of wheat and barley, of the grape, of the fig, of the pomegranate, Eretz Zeit Shemen Udvash, a land of olive oil and honey. Eretz Asher Lo B'Miskenu Tocha Balechen, you won't lack for bread there, you won't lack for anything. Eretz Asher Avanel Barzel, You'll have a land there. You're going into the land. This is chapter 8. And this verse is depicted on many, many pieces of art. It's a very popular verse. What is Moses trying to do here? What is he trying to say to the people? What kind of reaction is he supposed to get from people here as he's speaking to them about the land? Barry, you want to...
So I think it's a reminder that life is going to change dramatically. That in the wilderness, they've been sustained by man, which is, as we mentioned before we started recording, God's miracle food that he bestows upon the Israelites. And they're about to come to a land that is extraordinarily beautiful, however different it is from Egypt, and that can sustain the people if they're willing to work for it.
In fact, so we were speaking about the idea that manna represents a certain stage of development for the people, and that having your own food or creating your own food or working for your own food suggests a maturation of the people. Do we see that?
Well, on two levels. It's a maturation of a people because farming is for adults, but it's also civilizing. Right? Culture begins with agriculture. And it's important to recognize that civilization only develops material civilization when we can settle down and grow our own food and have a culture that we can build on site, as it were.
And so it's interesting you focus on that, because part of biblical culture in agriculture includes the response to the food, which is v'achalta v'savata v'rachta. Blessing. You have to bless God, be thankful for God. And this is going to be a really important theme here, because the idea is that you can take things for granted, that you think it just comes to you, right?
The book of Deuteronomy, in many places, has this attitude that that too much affluence and too much power correlates to a spiritual misguidedness. It correlates to forgetfulness of God's grace, and correlates to a puffed up attitude. And you'll say, as this parsha will say, it's because I am so successful and I am so powerful. That's why I have an abundant life. And the Deuteronomy, and certainly Judaism, Bigadol, not just this one text, views that with grave suspicion. It thinks that too much affluence produces a kind of laziness and arrogance, as opposed to an ethic of servitude and gratitude. So manna comes out to be, as we said before that we began the call, a kind of ambivalent symbolism. On the one hand, it's great, it's terrific, God provides you. On the other hand, that infantilizes you, and the maturation, the one food that is like mother's milk, and in the book of Numbers it explicitly refers to it in the kind of mother's milk vocabulary. So it's great food, but it's baby food. The adult food is agriculture. B'za'at apecha tochal lechem. You have to earn food by the sweat of your brow. But if you're too good at that, that's its own problem, and you get too arrogant. So you have to be brought down a peg and cultivate a sense of gratitude towards God.
So there needs to be a set of checks and balances in your theological disposition towards life. That is to say, some things God will be gracious to you and give you. You can't expect everything, and when you get them, you need to be grateful for them. And if we can just take this into the halachic realm, there's the interesting discussion halachically in terms of what is the minimum quantity of food that requires birkat hamazon. You recall this conversation, right? So it's like kazai. It's
one of the 7 species.
Right. Meaning that even if you were to eat a minimal amount, an olive bulk's worth, you would be required to recite birkat hamazon. Or seen in another way, which is the Jewish people is so grateful that even for an olive bulk's worth of food, they recite 10 minutes of birkat hamazon.
This is the great Talmud's great line, is that that actually God says v'achalta v'savata uverachta. God says you don't have to say birkat hamazon unless you really feel satisfied. But and in the Talmud's phrase, you gotta love the Jewish people. They express gratitude even for kazayat.
Yeah.
Right. Well, because I think we have to remember that being satisfied doesn't mean overeating or being engorged. You need enough room to recognize that you're satisfied as well. And I wanted to mention that the conversation reminds me of the 2 main blessings that we have at our Shabbat meal are Kiddush and Hamotzi, which are the 2 blessings that we recite, thanking God for creating the wine and the bread, even though they require human beings. Right? You can't grow wine or grow bread in the field. You have to make them. And the blessing reminds us that despite our hard work, God is the author of creation, and we have to recognize that even when we've produced what's on our table.
Interesting. I just want to add to that just the idea that both of those blessings, the wine and the bread, are 2/3 of 3 major foods that connect us to the land of Israel. Digancha, tiroshcha, v'yitzarecha, which we recognize from the Shema and other places, right? Your bread, your wine, and your oil. And these, the oil is represented by the lights on the candlelight. So digancha, your bread, motzi, tiroshcha, your wine, v'yitzhar, oil represented by the candle, and all 3 of them, as you said, Barry, are products of human behavior, of human industry as well.
Yeah.
So we have in the Parsha also, let's jump to chapter 10 for a second, because this I think inspires a lot of discussion. V'atay Yisrael, ma Adonai Elohecha shoel mimach. It's a turning point in the speech, and Moses is saying, "So now, Israel, what is God asking of you? What only is He asking of you?
Nothing big.
Nothing big, except Ki'im li'yirah Adonai Elohecha, just to have reverence, to fear God. Lalechet b'chol drachav, lava oto, to go in all His ways, to love God. Lavod et Adonai Elohecha, b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha, with all your heart, with all your soul." So the question is that something small? it's what does He ask you? What's He asking you? Only to do this.
So I want to suggest a slightly different translation.
Go ahead.
The vav doesn't always mean and. So the way I like to read it is that you have to fear God so that you walk in His ways, and you have to love Him so that you can worship Him.
Nice.
That if we don't love God, then we can't worship Him authentically. And that's another one of the great themes of the book of Devarim.
So let me just get that. I wanted to say it again because it's a good chiddush on this text. Walk us through that.
So we have to fear God not for its own sake, but so that we can walk in God's ways. Once we see God for what God is, then we can begin to emulate Him as best a human being can do. Mm-hmm. And only if we love Him can we properly worship Him. And, there's this tension throughout, as you both know, through rabbinic thought as well, between fear and love of God. The high holidays are coming up. It's a day off for me, thank God. But for you, it's one of the great themes of the day.
I can hear members of my congregation arguing with that and saying, but wait a minute, you don't have to necessarily fear God to do mitzvot. You don't have to necessarily love God to engage in worship. I mean, many of us and many of the people that we know are engaged in Jewish life and Jewish practice without that necessarily important and elemental theological connection. And for many people, even saying love God and do His mitzvot, is difficult. They'll say, look, I can do Shabbat makes sense. I can do Shabbat, but leave the loving God part out.
Yeah, but that's a little bit like, I would say, that's a little bit like, well, you can play a guitar that only has 5 strings attached, but you can play music on an out of tune instrument, and I suppose it's true, but you can't play it really well without this other element. I mean, I certainly want to be judgmental. Everybody has their own strengths, in their own repertoire of being a Jew, things that they're really great at and things that they struggle with. And so I don't presume to judge other people's spirituality. I do think that the ideal for what we're shooting for is pervaded by action and orientation, as a mental and a spiritual element, and that it includes those 2 themes of love and awe, and that it produces actual behavior. So with that, I'd like to just say a word about a line that comes immediately following, or 1 or 2 verses later, and I think it's really very relevant, because in chapter 10, verse 16, it says, "Umaltem et orlat levavchem," and you shall circumcise the foreskin of your heart. Ve'arpachem lo takshu od, and don't stiffen your neck again. Don't be stubborn and resistant. And in this religion, the one that we practice, and our sister religion, which is also a product of ancient Judaism, the circumcision of the heart is really, really important. And Paul, in the book of Romans, he says, basically the Jews circumcised their bodies, but this verse says that, Paul thought, this verse says that God doesn't really care so much about your bodies. God cares about your heart. And so Paul's, in the Christian scriptures, Paul's got a polemic against normative behavior and in favor of something more ephemeral like love and a so to speak spirit of the law that is not identified with the practice of the law. I think as a Jew, obviously I think spirit and love are important, but I think as a Jew, the circumcision of the heart is while very, very obviously very, very significant. It's not instead of the circumcision of the body. They have to go together in the exact way that Barry just said, that if you have love, it produces deeds of worship. It produces avodah. If you have awe, it produces walking in God's ways. Jews think that we have a spirit of the law, but you only obtain the spirit of the law through the letter of the law. It's got to be a match of the two of them together.
Why such an audacious metaphor? It does seem to be quite startling, how would you even begin to explain this? I did hear one lovely explanation, which is umaltem is to unveil, that is to say, to remove the barrier, and when we explain this on those terms, we are talking about relationship. And so and this kind of dovetails again with what Barry said. There are plenty of blockages between our relationship with God. After all, in Isaiah, solu panodera, pave the highway, create the highway, clear it out. The relationship between human beings and God can be strewn with all sorts of impediments and blockages.
And that's because our hearts, without getting too graphic about what they conceived of circumcising the male genitals, but they thought that there was a kind of outer shell that blocked the fullness of the person, and so you have to cut it away and open yourself up. Ramban was a Kabbalist and therefore kind of inherits a language of this is that or lat levavchem, circumcise your heart, means sheyehe levavchem patuach ladat ha'emet. Your heart has to be open to know the truth.
Do you know there is actually a membrane around the heart called the pericardium, and
but you don't want to cut it.
And it protects the heart. However, in people who have transplants, one of which I know quite well,
you know something about that.
They don't have a pericardium, because in order to remove the heart and transplant the heart, you have to remove it out of the pericardium, and there are people who suffer from pericarditis, the inflammation of that membrane. So I often wonder in reading this, it's not exactly just a metaphor. I mean, I am assuming that our ancestors knew one thing or two about human anatomy. They may not have dissected cadavers, but maybe they saw a pericardium and said, that's their problem. They have too much of a barrier.
So what I would like to add here is that the modern spin, of course, is that by saying umaltem el levavchem, we open it to women as well, because everyone has a heart.
Interesting.
And the community in Devarim is sometimes a male community, but sometimes includes the women and children as well. So here, at least, it opens up the possibility that God is talking to everyone. The other thing that came to mind is that the heart is in the front, as is the male genitalia, and the oref is the back. And that in order to approach God, you have to be facing God, as it were, with your person. And as we know, the heart is not just the heart as we understand it today, but for the rabbis in the biblical period, was the brain as well. It was the center of your being. And that has to be open, I think, as Jeremy beautifully put it before. And we don't want to turn our back on God. That's when things get hard, hence the stiff neck.
I want to just go back to the question Deuteronomy has. It's Moshe's question, Ma Adonai Elohecha shoel me'imach. What does God ask of you? And of course, we all have a biblical ear attuned to other key passages. And the first passage that we recall is the passage from Micha. Higid lecha Adam, ma tov uma Adonai doresh mimcha. What does God want for you? And Micha's answer is a very, very different answer from the answer that Moshe has provided. Micha's answer is asot mishpat, do justice, avat chesed, love mercy, vatznei alechet im Elohecha, and walk humbly with your God. So can we say, is Micha on the same page as Moshe? Is Micha arguing with Moshe? Is Micha in a continuum with Moshe?
I would say the same. I would say they're playing the same kind of music, but maybe with slightly different tones. When Moshe says, and I'm going to from here on in go with the Chesler translation, because I think that's just a perfect capture of what goes on here. That awe produces walking in the ways, and love produces worship or service. When Moshe says that you have to walk in God's ways, you have to imitate God. We might think of that famous rabbinic passage, Mahu rachum afatah have rachum, Mahu malbish arumim, and mevaker cholim, and machil re'evim, as God is feeding the hungry and visiting the sick and doing kindness, so too you should be. And so Micha has a tone of that. And and so I think that they are roughly the same. Micha is perhaps a teeny bit more explicit in the social dimension of the kindness towards others and doing justice in human contact. But I think that they're roughly the same kinds of messages.
Larry, you want to take a...
Yeah, I was going to say just maybe a difference in vocabulary due to the time difference. Micha lives in a different period. People speak in a slightly different idiom. It seems very close to me to be the same thing. What does appear, though, is that here in Devarim, the individual is addressed, and in Micha, I think one gets the sense in part that the community is addressed. That it's the community that has to love justice and the community that has to demonstrate mercy, because they don't work if only individuals do it.
Well, it could be the opposite in the following way. Moshe says, "V'ata Yisrael, ma Adonai Elohecha shoel me'imach," and Micha says, "Higid lecha Adam." The one may be a message for Jewish people and one for human beings.
Okay.
Jewish human beings.
That's us.
No, but so he's saying, look, Jews, that I'm talking to you, be a mensch. Yeah. That's the major, and of course in rabbinic literature, this text from Micha is one of the key texts. Can the Torah, can all of Judaism be reduced into certain phrases? Yeah, Micha reduced it into 3. He said that this is the ultimate: love, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God. You can see it on the...
I would say also, by the way, this goes back, Elliot, to what you were saying about, and we certainly all know people who appreciate Jewish culture without the kind of manifestly theological or religious dimensions. I do think that the Torah and its interpreters throughout the centuries have sought to shape a religious personality. And I think Micha, maybe his formulation more than Moshe's formulation, or maybe not. Maybe it's just a little different. But Moshe's formulation is be a reverent and loving person, and Micha's formulation is do the right thing and have virtues of kindness and modesty and humility. And I just think that Micha's formulation, man, it's very stirring to me. Yeah. Do the right thing and be the right kind of person, be loving and be humble.
I'm not sure, does Moshe's language work? Because obviously Micha's language is something that we can gravitate to much more easily. And the question that you're asking is, what kind of human being is being fashioned here? How is the text trying to fashion us? And Moshe is trying to fashion us as, a reverent but obedient person, and Micha is, I would say, he's trying to fashion us in terms of humble.
Mm-hmm. Micha, in that prophetic way, Micha is among among those prophets like Isaiah, who kind of ridicules all the sacrifices. I happen to know this one because it was my bar mitzvah haftarah. That he says, what do I need? Do I need forests full of firewood? Do I need rivers full of oil? Do I need all herds full of animals to sacrifice? I don't need any of that stuff. I need this kind of personality. And speaking in God's voice. So Micha is that kind of prophet who maybe has a little bit of a skeptical attitude towards some of the outward manifestations and favors some more of the inner manifestations, which is, of course, not really true of Moshe, who spends a lot of time about the outward manifestations.
Interesting.
So the other thing is that with Moshe, you have to consider who he's talking to. The problem that characterized Bnei Israel in the Midbar is that they didn't listen. So obedience is obviously a principal concern. In the time of Micha, the people are already established in the land, and the social fabric is being undone by people who claim to be religious. And you can't, I think Ramban's expression was fool within the law. You can't follow the law and be either an Amaritz, an ignoramus, or someone who's unethical. It's that the combination of the two that makes, as Jeremy was saying earlier, the religious personality that we strive to be. It's not the choosing one or the other.
So we would be remiss in the moments that are remaining to us if we didn't talk about the second paragraph of the Shema, which is located in this Parsha. It's chapter 11, verse 13 and on. If you hearken to my mitzvot. And this chapter, this paragraph of the Shema, basically lists out what's going to ensue. You'll be rewarded if you follow. You'll be punished if you don't follow. You'll be able to have your rain in season. You'll have plenty of food. Your animals will have food, and you will eat, and you will be satisfied. But if you don't, if you desert them, God will be angry. So are we seeing a snapshot of the development of Jewish theology here in the way that it's relating to God? Jeremy, you're nodding, so...
I do. The second paragraph of the Shema, as our listeners probably know, takes this very strong reward and punishment kind of approach that can be a little hard to swallow. I mean, our listeners might know that in the 1940s, when Mordechai Kaplan published the Siddur, when Reconstructionism at that time was sort of a trend within conservatism, not its own independent movement, and the Siddur took the second paragraph of the Shema out and replaced it with other texts, because he said we simply can't say with a straight face that God makes it rain. But that line that if you turn your heart and worship other gods, then v'charaf Adonai b'chem, God will be enraged with you. Ve'atzar et hashamayim, and close up the heavens. Pshat, simple semantic meaning, it seems to mean that there won't be any rain and you'll have a drought. But I find that such an incredibly poetic phrase. Heaven will be closed off to you. I think that there's a kind of a religious, spiritual connection that you have when you worship God, that if you go worshiping false gods, heaven is closed off to you. You don't have that experience by dint of your attachment to false gods, by the false gods of money and sex and power and all the things that people love nowadays, not just nowadays, throughout all time. So I do feel like it's almost like we're getting a message from the, however many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Yeah, this is what people at this particular moment in time find meaningful. This is the kind of relationship to God and picture of God that people in the Midbar could find meaningful in a way that can be a little hard going for contemporary
In a
people.
way, it's analogous to what we talked about, the barriers, the human barriers to God. It's God saying, look, if you're going to worship other gods, there'll be a barrier between me and you. And that's, I mean, when we are engaged in reciting the Shema, we are entering that world where this is reality. And we're stepping into that. Go ahead, Barry.
There's a great existential question. What kind of universe do we live in? Yeah. And the claim of our ancestors up until relatively recently is that we lived in a moral universe where the universe responded to human moral behavior. The existentialists, which is what makes it an existential question, believed in an indifferent universe, that the universe doesn't care about us. And I think in some ways, philosophically, a lot of people find that appealing, but we want to live in a world where the universe does respond to us. One of the great political issues of our day is climate change and how the earth responds to human behavior. So I think that there is still great meaning in the second paragraph of the Shema, because our actions have consequences. It may not have to do with the rain, although acid rain, as I recall, was one of the big issues not so long ago, but it does have to do with fashioning the world that we live in and being a partner with God and creating that world. As our ancestors taught, we're partners with God in creation, and you have to have a kind of universe that responds to human behavior to be that partner.
Indeed, the universe that Moshe is trying to construct here for us is a universe in which God does respond, and God will provide both the material sustenance that you depend on, and that you, by not just being obedient to God, it's not asking for obedience, but it's to be in a relationship with God, in the fullness of that relationship, which can consist of all the emotional colors that we're all familiar with. So in a way, this text, it belongs in the Shema because it enables us to enter a world of accountability, and it enables us to enter a world in which we are thinking about this relationship.
So I would just add one thing, that we need a relationship with God, but our relationship with God is dependent upon our relationship with the world as well. Now, we can't separate the two. We can't behave one way with God and then somehow differently with the world. And what the second paragraph of the Shema reminds us is that God needs the world too. And he also responds.
Hamim ti im Adonai Elohecha. You have to, and what you just said is really inspiring, because Tamim ti im Adonai Elohecha, you shall have integrity. Let's call it that way. To translate that way.
Wholehearted.
A person has to have integrity. You can't behave one way with the physical world and then expect a different kind of spiritual relationship with God. And similarly with your fellow human beings, you have to be. You have to have a kind of integrity and tamimut, purity, in all the areas of your life for this religious path to really work.
So here we've come to the end of our time together with this parsha. I think there's just so much to think about. It's a parsha of relationship, a parsha of the land, but at its core, it's a parsha that engages us in thinking and imagining, just the way that it has engaged the three of us. We are all in our different places as usual, thinking back and recalling, 7th and 8th weeks of the summer. And telling and with our loyal listeners and viewers who got the price of admission today for the beautiful insights of my wonderful colleagues, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanowski, Rabbi Barry Chesler, and on their behalf, I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamed. I want to thank you and wish everyone Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.